Which is some people see me and they go, that sounds about right. Anyway, this talk is part of our Meet Jesus Week events that UQ Evangelical Students, the Christian group, is running. And we in this group really want to help UQ and UQ students to think about life's big questions. And for everyone to meet Jesus and see how he answers those big questions. So we'd like all of you to please take this chance to ask the questions that you wouldn't normally ask. Right? There is no question that's too small or too silly, and there's no question that's too big or difficult. We want to hear them all. And so we're all about meeting Jesus. I'm all about meeting Jesus. How did I meet Jesus? I grew up overseas, and for most of my life have struggled with ideas of home and belonging. And so for me, a really key moment of meeting Jesus properly was understanding how I was trying really hard to look for somewhere on earth to call home. But actually what Jesus did for me means I have a forever home in heaven with him. And I can rest in that. And that was a really significant way that I met Jesus through my childhood. And I still love meeting Jesus. I get really excited to have conversations with people about Jesus. I love it, love it when people ask me questions I don't know the answer to, because usually there's a great conversation there. And I love reading one of the biographies of Jesus in the Bible with people, because I want to help other people meet Jesus and find home and rest in him. So as we start, that's a little bit of background, as we start the talk today, just a few housekeeping things. We've got some response cards on your table, so if you'd like to give us your details and get in contact with us, that's a great way to do that. There's also a QR code. There's 2 QR codes on the front of the handout you would have got when you came in. One of them is the same as the feedback form on your table, so the bottom one is a digital way to get connected, and that would be great if you wanted to do that. But the one I really want to draw your attention to is the top QR code that says submit your questions for Q&A. In a minute, the wonderful Glen, Scrivener, is going to get up and do a talk, and then we'll have a chance for a Q&A with him. And this is the best way, the way, in fact, for you to submit your questions so that you can ask him and get him to answer them. So that's really important there. I mentioned Glen Scrivener. Here he is, he's coming soon. He's, I believe, I'm told this is correct, he's originally from Australia, best country, but he doesn't live here at the moment. He lives in the UK. He's written many different books, and so thought really deeply about Jesus and how to help people meet him. He likes the intersection of faith and culture. This is great. So please ask him all of your hairy questions, because he's all about helping people meet Jesus. And today he's going to talk about hope, a really wonderful thing that I think all of us look for. He's going to talk about hope and where it comes from. So I'm going to get him up, we're going to interview him and get to know him a little bit, and make sure you can hear him.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, there we are.
Yes.
And then he'll give us the talk. So, Glen, that's your name.
Hello.
But who are you,
Oh.
and what do you do with yourself when you're not here talking to uni students in
Okay,
Australia?
I am Emma's husband. I'm Ruby and JJ's dad. I live in England, on the south coast of England. It's called the Sunshine Coast. It's all relative, isn't it? And I grew up in Canberra, so it's fine for me. So I grew up in Canberra, did a bunch of school and uni things in England, and then came back to Australia, then went back to England, then got deported back to Australia, then ended up with a spouse visa. It's not the only reason I married Emma, but it certainly helped. And been married to her for 20 years now, and we've got 2 kids. Ruby is 10, JJ is 7.
Very cool. And how did you meet Jesus, Glen?
I met Jesus, well, my mother is a great Christian, and she was praying for me a lot. And as a teenager, in my early teenage years, I got very serious about Jesus and sort of gave my life to Jesus about 1,000 times, I think, in my teenage years. But never really thought that God had accepted me. And so kind of walked away from him and from church and tried to get as far away from Jesus to have as much fun as I possibly could without him. And what brought me back was actually at the end of university, a friend of mine kept on inviting me to church, and I ended up going along. And he also said, why don't you open up the Gospels together? And because I think my vision of God was just this sort of distant power, which wasn't very exciting. And he said, well, if Jesus is what God's like, why don't you get to know him? And so we read through the Gospels together. And I remember getting halfway through the Gospels and just thinking, Jesus is it. He's tops, he's numero uno, he's head honcho, he's Lord. And as soon as a Christian starts to say he's Lord, it's like bad luck, you're a Christian. It just sneaks up on you. And that's what happened to me about 25 years ago.
Right. And so that's sort of what the process looked like for you. There might be some people in the room who are right at the start of that, who are checking Jesus out for the first time or in that first stage. What's your top tip for them? If somebody's got questions about Jesus or they're just checking him out.
I would say maybe do the same thing. These are free for people? Is that
yes,
right?
there are. There's a whole heap of them on the table here.
Wow. Billy Bargain. So, get into this. And I would say, just look, shoot up a prayer and just say, Jesus, if you are real, show yourself. It's one of those no-lose propositions, isn't it? Like, if he's not there, he's not going to answer, but if he is there, wouldn't it be amazing if God was exactly like Jesus, the one who came and stooped and served and suffered and bled and died for you? Wouldn't that be amazing if that's what God's like? Well, you can do a little experiment. Say, Jesus, show yourself, crack it open. And then if Jesus does indeed speak to you through this, well, I guess this is Christ's word then, right? And it sort of vindicates itself. So why don't you put him to the test and, pray that kind of prayer, open up and see if you don't meet Jesus for yourself.
Thanks, Glen. I'm going to read a bit out of, not one of those books, but also from the Bible now, and then Glen will come up and give us the talk. There's a section in your handouts that you've been given. This is, it says on the screen, it says in hand, but Philippians 2, 5 to 7. Philippians is just a letter that a guy called Paul wrote 2,000 years ago, and Paul met Jesus for himself, and that changed his life. And so and one of the things that changed was writing all of these letters. And so this is his summary, his very poetic summary of who Jesus is, what he did, and why it matters. So I'll read that for us, and then I'll give us the talk. Philippians 2, verse 5, which is just the little number 5 at the top. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Thanks.
Thank you, Ellie. We're thinking about hope this afternoon. Where does hope come from? And maybe one way of asking this question is to ask, what shape do you think life takes? Do you think life is a tragedy or is it a comedy? Is life a tragedy or a comedy? And as students, you know not to answer the question straight away without defining terms, right? You're not going to dive in with both feet without having understood the terms of the question. So what is a tragedy and what is a comedy? I'm glad you asked. Well, a tragedy, according to Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy, so he ought to know what a tragedy and a comedy is. He said, a tragedy is a story that begins in joy and ends in pain, but a comedy is a story that begins in pain and ends in joy. You get it? So tragedy is you might begin on a high, but you end on a downer. It's kind of shaped like a frowny face. That's how you know it's a tragedy. You might climb up in the world. You might have a grand adventure. You might experience all kinds of wonderful things. But if you tumble down into an unhappily ever after, what do you call that story? Dante says you call that a tragedy. On the other hand, if you plumb the depths and go down into a pit, but somehow there is a great turn, what J.R.R. Tolkien called a eucatastrophe, a good catastrophe, right? That instead of a catastrophe that turns everything good bad, that it turns everything sad, it becomes untrue. And all of a sudden you go down into the pit, but you take a turn and up into the happily ever after. What do you call that? You call that a comedy. Think of Shakespeare, okay? Shakespeare has three kinds of plays. He's got his histories, his tragedies, and his comedies, okay? And the difference between his tragedies and his comedies is not the amount of laughter in the audience, because I don't know if you were like me studying Shakespeare at high school, but my teacher, when they were teaching about Shakespeare, would have to tell me where the jokes were, right? At this point, Hamlet is telling a joke, and I would go, oh. And then I'd write in my exercise book, Hamlet is telling a joke, apparently. And then I put that in the exam, and then you pass, right? It's not that your hands and thighs are becoming leathery from being slapped together so much. Oh, how very humorous. That's not what tells you that Shakespeare is either telling you a tragedy or a comedy. What tells you whether it's a tragedy is, at the end of all of Shakespeare's tragedies, you have death, okay? And sometimes the dead are just piled deep on the stage. And if you're as uncultured as me, you're trying to spot whether the actors are still sort of breathing from their big sword duel at the end and that kind of thing. But that makes it a tragedy. If it ends with a funeral, you know it's a tragedy. Whereas all of Shakespeare's comedies, they all end with, anyone? A wedding. Culture vulture, Ellie over here. A wedding, right? Okay. Sometimes 2 weddings, sometimes 4 weddings. Okay. So that's the classical happily ever after, where the guy and the girl, they finally get together, right? And you finish on a wedding and a song. That's what makes a comedy. So now that we've got our terms defined, now I can ask my question again. What is life, right? Is life a tragedy or is it a comedy? Well, just ask yourself the question. Does my life end with a funeral or a wedding? A funeral, right? So if your life was written by Shakespeare, what would they call it? They would call it a tragedy, wouldn't they? Which is not to say that you can't have grand adventures in this life. You can go out there and slay the dragons. You can go out there and voyage across the 7 seas and have all the experiences that you like in life. But that is like getting up in the world, enjoying your brief moment in the sun, ticking off all your bucket list items. But then comes the bucket, right? That's the thing about the bucket list. You might tick off all the items on it, but then you kick the bucket, right? And what do you call that shape? Well, you call it a tragedy, don't you? Might be a grand adventure, but it is ultimately a tragedy if it ends with a funeral. And that is the shape of life, naturally speaking. The natural shape of your life is you're born with nothing. You grow in stature, you grow in strength, you grow in wisdom, hopefully, and here you are, enjoying your moment in the sun. You're at University of Queensland, right? And here you are, enjoying your green salad days. You know, these are the good old days that you'll look back on in the future. They really are. And then, at some stage, you get over the hill, right? And then you plunge down the other side. I'm definitely on the other side of this kind of. You know, when I was your age, I would go to the doctor with problems, and the doctor would actually try to fix me. It was wonderful. You know, I used to play a lot of cricket, and I'd go with my shoulder injury, and they were like, "Oh, you're 20. You're the future. We must do everything we can to fix you." And they'd send me to physios, and they'd give me like regimes of physiotherapy, of treatment, and they'd pass electric current through my shoulder. They'd really try to fix me. Now I go to the doctor with the same shoulder injury, and they say, "Have you tried paracetamol?" No. They are just trying to manage the decline. That is all they're trying to do. Once you get to my age, nobody tries to fix you, okay? Because they all know you're on the far side of the tragedy. And down you plunge into the grave. And it's a tragic way of life. And we kind of know this, like all of advertising is trying to tell you this sort of story of you got to grab and climb and get and be on top and enjoy this thing. And you want to stave off the end of the story as much as possible. That's why we have a cult of youth, isn't it? You know, all the magazines are just emblazoned with 17-year-old models that look like 12-year-old girls. And the advertising is all, you know, how to fight the 7 signs of aging. And it's an utter cult of youth. Why? Because we're convinced that this is a tragic story. And we don't want to get to the end. Okay? So we're all trying desperately to cling on to youth. But as much as you try to cling on to youth, I'm afraid time wins, right? The tragedy wins. Over the hill you go and down into the grave. You might think of yourself personally, you might think of, I don't know, the heat death of the universe of all things. Like there is entropy, there is decline, there is aging, there is the grave. What do you call this? If Shakespeare was to write the story of the universe, what would they call it? Well, according to so many people, the story of the universe is just a tragic story. From nothing into some kind of bright, shining experience, and down into entropy and decay and death. Tragedy. Until you come to Philippians chapter 2. Right? Because in the Bible, we've actually got a comedy. Okay? The Bible is actually shaped like a comedy. It's not shaped like a frowny face. The Bible actually begins with the God of light, life, and love. And then there's a fall down into a pit of darkness and death and disconnection. But then the God of love actually enters into that pit. His name is Jesus. And he takes on our darkness and death and disconnection on that cross. And then he rises again. So that at the end of all things, he wants to invite you into his happily ever after. Right? The shape of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, is the shape of a comedy. And the shape here in Philippians 2, Paul, who's writing this, he's giving to us a summary of the Bible's story. And it's totally a smiley face, which is an extraordinary thing. Here is your one shot at the comedy. The whole universe is kind of preaching tragedy to you. All advertising is preaching tragedy to you. Your own biology is preaching tragedy to you. And the Word of God is wanting to offer you a comedy. It's worth investigating, isn't it? I mean, you might conclude that the Christian story is a fairy tale and is best laid aside. But if somebody is offering you your one shot at the comedy, it's certainly worth investigating, wouldn't you say? Here is the Apostle Paul. He has met Jesus famously on the road to Damascus, the risen Jesus. He had persecuted the followers of Jesus of Nazareth after Jesus rose from the dead. He didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead until he met Jesus, and that utterly transformed his life. He went shooting his mouth off around the Mediterranean, and churches start erupting within the first few years of Jesus rising again from the dead. It's kind of astonishing. He gets to the city of Philippi in Greece in around about 50 AD. So he's what, like 17 years after the resurrection event. It's like when he first arrives at Philippi, it's like he's talking about, oh, remember when Jesus died and rose again? That was back in 2008. Do you remember 2008? Some of you are like 1 year old in 2008. But that's the sort of thing he was saying. Remember back in 2008, Jesus died and rose again? And he visited the city of Philippi, he moved on, and a few years later he wrote back to them this letter. And there's a bit of disgruntlement in the church, there's some factionalism that's happening, and Paul is wanting to reunite this community that is gathered around the risen Jesus. And he does it by actually reminding them of a hymn that the early church was singing. I'm pretty convinced that what he's giving them here is actually a song that was in existence long before Paul wrote about this. So again, this is like a classic hit from the 2010s, okay? And he's reminding the church of this classic song that they were all singing in the 2010s about events that had happened just a few years earlier. Okay, this is very early. Sometimes people sort of think about Jesus and the resurrection, and they think that like mythology developed after the resurrection of Jesus, and they imagine that there were these accretions of stories, like barnacles on the hull of an old ship, that sort of more and more mythological characteristics of Jesus were kind of added until centuries later he starts being spoken of as a God who rose from the dead and all that kind of stuff. Utter nonsense. Utter ahistorical nonsense. The earliest stuff we have about Jesus, and this is very early, the earliest stuff we have about Jesus calls him God and says he rose from the dead. So if you ever hear people saying, oh yeah, no, it was just a mythology about Jesus, it grew up after the Jesus story was long forgotten. Utter nonsense. Jesus is God. Jesus has risen from the dead. That is the earliest proclamation. And that is what set the church